Roland Ratzenberger, born July 4th, 1960, in the town of Salzburg, Austria. Salzburg was and still is the fourth largest city in Austria, holding well over 100,000 people. The city is surrounded by mountains, giving the area an impressive view, and in these mountain valleys is the town of Geisberg. Geisberg, since 1929, hosted an annual hill climb, and at the age of 7, Ratzenberger and his grandmother went to the race. He became fascinated with the speed in cars roaring through the mountains, and it sparked a passion. That spark was fueled in 1969 when the Salzburg ring was built. It was a 2.635-mile test of man, with long, fast straightaways, many being long, sweeping corners. It kept the speeds high and the danger ever present. Ratzenberger went to technical school in his hometown and eventually met Walter Lechler, the owner of the Formula 4 team named after himself. He would frequent the location of the team, fascinated with their work. Eventually, by the time he was able to, he became an employee and was one of the first at Walter's new racing school. They ran the school at the Salzburg ring, and by the time that Ratzenberger was 22, he was ready to take on the racing world. In 1983, Roland started running for the German Formula Ford circuit. He quickly began picking up speed over the 1983 and 84 seasons, and by 1985, he won the Austrian and Central European Formula Ford championships. He accompanied the two titles with a second-place finish in the standings for the German wing of the series as well, and a podium for the Brands Hatch Formula Ford Festival. He improved the result at Brands Hatch the following season with winning it. It was apparent that he was ready to move to the British Formula 3, where with West Series Racing, he surprisingly disappointed. 2 12th-place results in standings. He did, however, take his driving talents to the World Touring Car Championship, or WTCC. He claimed 2 second-place finishes for the Schnitzer team, driving a BMW M3. He looked forward to the 1988 season with Schnitzer, but the WTCC folded. With only his abysmal 1988 F3 season, he moved to the British Formula 3000 series. He finally claimed victory once again, and finished podium in the championship. Roland during this began to also find a fascination in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, running in the 1989 edition but finishing 49th out of 56 cars. In 1990, Roland made a career change. He went to Japan and raced many of the local series there. He became one of the Japanese sports car prototype series top drivers, and with the same SARD team he ran with in Japan, he attempted the 1990 24 Hours of Le Mans. He made it further this time, but still lost an engine, well short of the finish line. In 1991, Ratzenberger ran the race in a Porsche, and once again didn't finish. In 1992, he ran with his Japanese team again, and finally finished the race. He was 9th overall, and in 1993, he got his first class win, coming home 5th overall. Whilst his Le Mans career was going on, Ratzenberger tried F3000 again in 1992. This time it was in Japan, and Roland finally claimed victory. It put him ahead of former teammate Eddie Irvine, and Irvine after 1992 would debut in F1 with Jordan. And to note his debut season, he pissed off Ayrton Senna by unlapping himself and got decked for it. If it wasn't obvious enough that Irvine was controversial, the FIA also judged him to be at fault for a 4-car pileup and gave him a 1-race suspension for the start of 1994. When Eddie appealed the penalty, the suspension was increased to 3 races. Ratzenberger beating Irvine in standings right before him getting an F1 ride with Jordan, along with his win in Le Mans, gave him his reputation to be considered in F1. Sports manager Barbara Bailau liked Roland and worked to get him an F1 seat for 1994 at the brand new Simtek team. A deal was made and Roland was slated for 5 F1 races with the possibility of more. It was official. Roland Ratzenberger was an F1 driver. The 1994 circuit for motorsports elite division started in Brazil. The Simtek team showed up to their first event. Both drivers Ratzenberger and David Brabham began turning the first competitive laps of the team's history. Simtek itself was an interesting team. The company's full name, Simulation Technology, was originally founded in 1989 by Max Mosley and former race engineer Nick Wirth. It originally was started to simply be a supplier/constructor of resources for race teams, but after a few years of doing such practice, Wirth decided that the organization had the ability to field an F1 team. Thus began the F1 wing of the organization. David Brabham attained his ride mainly due to his father being a substantial stakeholder in the Simtek Grand Prix, and before Roland was signed with the team, they had considered Gilles de Ferran and Andrea de Cesaris, but it never came together. With Nick Wirth managing the team, He hired Charlie Moody to manage it all. They settled on Ford V8 engines from Cosworth as their power supply, and the always relevant MTV Europe as a sponsor for the team. The team built their car for '94 with the intent of active suspension being enabled. However, in a gust of FIA glory, it was outlawed, and quickly the SimTech team went into a scramble and pieced together an underwhelming S941. The car was abysmal. It was one of the heaviest on the grid, and it contained a fully manual gearbox to stack on. The team was underemployed compared to the other F1 teams, 35 employees in total. With that, it would not be surprising that Ratzenberger failed to qualify. While Brabham clinged to the last grid spot in 26th, Brabham did end up finishing a surprising 12th, but he was the last car on track, simply getting the spot because of attrition. The next race was in Japan, where Roland made his first race ironically. He turned his first laps in his home away from home, and whilst Brabham fell out on lap 2 due to an electrical issue, Ratzenberger finished, but like Brabham in Brazil, he was the last car on track in 11th. The next race was the San Marino Grand Prix in Imola. Imola is a particularly unique track. At the time in 1994, the series of Tamburello, Turn 1, and Villeneuve, Turn 2, were very fast, flat, wide sweeping corners. This sequence displayed characteristics of Ratzenberger's home track in Salzburg. The aforementioned high-speed flat curves, daring will and testing the grit of any driver who caressed through them. They are very dangerous, to say the least, but they are also a spectacle. Friday practice started like any other, but nearing the end of the day, Brazilian Rubens Barrichello was launched over curbing and flew violently into a tire barrier. The roaring sound of helicopter rotors made their first appearance that afternoon, as Rubens was airlifted from the track. He survived the incident, but it was a terrifying moment in the paddock. It got everyone's attention. Near the end of the session before Rubens' accident, Roland's front wing had started to come undone. They came in and looked at repairing said wing, but the only one there with any authority in SimTech was team manager Charlie Moody. He had no real experience in fixing said wing, so he started walking around the paddock, inquiring with a few other teams on how to fix the issue. After various failed attempts, the issue was fixed in an unknown manner. Saturday qualifying in Imola. Cars blitzed on track with Ratzenberger taking one of the first off-track blunders. In the Acqua Minerale chicane, he veered off but kept going. Perhaps he felt a little more distress. This was the first time that SimTech sponsors were in attendance, and with only 2 more races after Imola for his driving contract, he wanted to impress. He sped off, completing the lap, and through the Tautza hairpin on the next lap, he spun again, and quickly got it going. Again, he felt fine with the car. He sped around and started another lap. Unknown to Ratzenberger, though, he was now charging full speed in the Tamburello. The supposed repaired front wing had become broken again, and he flew through Tamburello with nothing out of the ordinary. It was completely routine. But then he got into Villeneuve. The wing finally snapped the rest of the way, and lodged under the front wheel. Ratzenberger went hopelessly sailing into the outside wall at a speed of 195 miles an hour. As the car came to rest, the medical workers tried desperately to save him. He was far too gone. Ratzenberger sustained a ruptured aorta, which in of itself can easily kill you. He also sustained a basilar skull fracture, the same injury so many other drivers have perished from. And he also took blunt trauma from his left front tire penetrating the survivor cell. Bernie Ecclestone was the first to walk up to the SimTech team and deliver the news. It sent SimTech in the shock. Teammate David Brabham, whilst shaken from the accident and loss of a friend, decided to race still the next day. Ayrton Senna, who, when told about Ratzenberger's passing, was inconsolable. He was encouraged to withdraw, but he refused, as saying, "I cannot quit, I have to go on." They offered Ratzenberger's grid spot to Paul Bimaldo, but he declined out of respect for Ratzenberger, and so the spot was left open for him. Now, if you know anything about racing, you know what happened shortly after the start of the race on Sunday. Ayrton Senna ran wide in Tamburello and hit the outside wall at around 140 miles an hour. Ayrton Senna became the second fatality that weekend at Imola, steeping the weekend in an even darker shadow. When officials inspected the car after removing Senna, trying desperately to save the Brazilian hero's life, they found an Austrian flag. It was going to be a tribute to the fallen Salzburg native. Sadly, as media attention goes, Senna's passing greatly overshadowed Ratzenberger's. While Senna's funeral was attended en masse, Roland's was barely seen. The only drivers who did attend his funeral were Gerhard Berger, Karl Weidlinger, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, Johnny Herbert, and teammate David Brabham. FIA President Max Mosley also attended his funeral, feeling that Ratzenberger had not been represented in the shadow of Senna. Months after Ratzenberger's funeral, the car he was going to run at Le Mans that year took to the track. He had been replaced by Eddie Irvine, the man who helped him get an F1 ride inadvertently. But on the name rail still sat the Austrian flag, along with Roland Ratzenberger. Whilst being forgotten by the public, he was remembered by his friends, making sure that he was never a forgotten tragedy.